wanted to open by saying that when I was first asked by Nicole to participate in Ideas, she told me that the series was inspired by the TED Talks, which, of course, typically incorporate cutting-edge technology. And I got a little worried because I'm here to talk about rural lifeways and our assumptions about what it means to live rurally. And I didn't really want to use PowerPoint, but I didn't want you to fall into the trap of assuming that just because I'm from the countryside, I'm technologically illiterate or behind the times. So I considered bringing along my BlackBerry just to prove to you that I'm with it. The problem with that is that my blackberries don't ripen until about August, so that was a no-go. Yeah, I'm an Apple fan too, but you can guess where that's going. So why should we care whether rural communities live or die? In rural Cape Breton and in rural communities throughout North America, the narrative is one of struggle. We have aging populations, our youth are leaving. We fight to retain vital services like schools and hospitals. A shrinking pool of exhausted volunteers works to run the fire departments and the rinks and the community halls. Family farms are dying as industrial agriculture devours the landscape. And more people live in cities than ever before. As a rural dweller on a subsistence farm, I've had people tell me that I'm trying to turn back the clock, that I'm living in a fantasy world, that if I really expect access to education and healthcare services, it's simple. I should just move to the city. Hard to have a cow in the city, by the way. Most depressingly, I've had people in my own community tell me that I should just accept the fact that my small rural school will and should close. The message that communities in the countryside are dying, that their death is natural, and that it should be accepted is often echoed in provincial and federal government policies and within the larger society. Over the next 20 minutes, I want to explore our relationship to the idea of rural, to look at some of the assumptions that underlie society's thinking about rural spaces and lifeways, and to suggest a few connections between those assumptions and the public policies that threaten the viability of rural communities. I want to talk about why rural lifeways matter, why we should care whether rural communities live or die on a practical level, on a philosophical level, and on what I'll call a species level. And I want to introduce you to some of the rural dwellers who are conducting on-the-ground research into rural viability and evolving the philosophies that underpin a healthier rural society. So there are a lot of definitions of rural, an awful lot of definitions of rural. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be using the rural and small town definition that was developed by Statistics Canada. According to this definition, a rural community is any community or locale with fewer than 10,000 people and where fewer than 50% of the population commutes to an urban area. So putting that in a Cape Breton context, the entire population of mighty Victoria County was just under 7,600 at the time of the 2006 census. Very rural place. While the entire CBRM as a whole is above that population threshold, many of your individual communities within CBRM are rural by that definition. And really much of Nova Scotia can be considered rural. Really about 55% of voters live in rural areas. As a rural dweller who's lived in Middle River for almost 9 years, I've encountered an entertaining variety of perceptions about rural life, most often expressed by those who do not live rurally, but sometimes even internalized and expressed by folks in my own community. I'm not a sociologist, but I'm going to do my best to describe a few of those attitudes and to hazard a guess about where they come from. The first, maybe my favorite, is what I call the country living magazine view of rurality. Think Martha Stewart, think white picket fences, perfect apple pies cooling on windowsills, possibly a pretty pink piglet with a little bow on its neck, that kind of thing. It's a romantic, very idealized view that often contains more than a large dollop of nostalgia for a bygone era, or at least for a bygone era as represented on 50s television. It seems to be a view often held by people who are a couple of generations removed from the actual experience of a farm. Maybe they remember going on childhood visits to grandma's place in the country, but it's become very idealized for them. People who hold this view of rural life are so exciting to host at my house, and they're often dismayed because they visit my farm and they find very prosaic things like mud, peeling paint, biting insects, lots of manure, features that rarely make it into Country Living magazine. It's not a particularly helpful image. It reduces rural living to a very sanitized stereotype. And it also perpetuates the idea of farms as we would like them to be. It's an image that industrial agriculture and to some degree provincial and federal departments of agriculture have been pretty happy to promote because it's easier for the public to swallow the happy cow version of agriculture than the reality of contained animal feeding operations and other industrial nightmares that kill rural communities and harm the environment, dishonor animals, diminish nutritional standards, and bear no resemblance whatsoever to what most of us would like to think of as farms. There's also a long-held view of rural spaces as being backwards, closed-minded, dangerously conservative, lacking in culture and civility. And this gets reflected in our language. We still use phrases like hick, hayseed, country bumpkin, yokel, didn't just fall off the turnip truck yesterday, that kind of thing. And it speaks to our lingering sense that people who live or choose to live in rural areas are somehow simple, gullible, foolish, unintelligent. You could laugh at this, but it's an attitude that really comes to the forefront whenever things like the school consolidation debate rears its head. And I've had to fight this a couple of times now. Despite solid research and evidence to the contrary, there remains this frustrating perception that rural schools provide an inferior quality of education just by virtue of the fact that they're rural. It's a perception that bigger is better. And that's an attitude that has effectively killed thousands of community schools and arguably communities across the country. So another attitude stems from the fact that we live in a consumer society. It's not surprising that rural spaces often get defined and perceived in purely economic terms. We talk about good land. It's a very subjective notion. And when we say good land, we tend to mean good for agriculture, good for resource extraction, good for recreation, as if the land itself is not inherently good, whether it serves human interests or not. I would agree that rural communities need to be able to sustain themselves, so a discussion of economics is always necessary. But it's important to place the land's inherent value first. The sustainability of human communities cannot be divorced from the sustainability of the land and its denizens. And too often, discussions about rural sustainability start and end with a discussion of a region's money-generating potential. There's also a sense, which is less often expressed outright, but it's often implied, that rural spaces are kind of dangerous, wild, or out of control, and that we should fear them. Think the movie Deliverance, if you've seen Deliverance, or Into the Wild. I had a friend once who visited in our rural area, and it was really interesting because he was from an urban place, and a lot of the sounds that were in the background, which we don't even really hear anymore, were almost made him fearful. What was that? What was that? Oh, I think it was a frog. What was that? Rooster, just because he wasn't used to the idea of the countryside. Poet and rural activist Gary Snyder wrote a great essay on the words wild, nature, and wilderness. And he makes the point that the wild has for us threatening connotations of disorder, and we're not comfortable with disorder. The word nature, he says, has come to mean something set aside over there. It's important, we should preserve it, but it's not us, okay? It's in national parks, or you preserve nature, we're not of nature. Our fear of wildness or disorder and our tendency to want to control and corral that wildness by putting it in places set apart, to me stems directly from that old cosmology that Sister Margie Gillis spoke so eloquently about in a recent Ideas talk. And if you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. I stood up and went, woohoo, when I saw it. It was great. This is a cosmology that places God at the apex of a pyramid with humans below that, animals lower down, plant life, rocks, I don't know what comes below that. But it's a hierarchical worldview, which in the Judeo-Christian tradition is often expressed in the interpretation of that line in Genesis, where God gives man dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, the cattle, and all of that. Now, to be fair, for many of us, that line implies stewardship, a caregiving, a caretaking, reciprocal relationship. But arguably, it's something that's been internalized by the culture at large to grant humanity dominance and the right to control and subdue the rest of the natural world. An attitude that's allowed for, among other things, factory trawling, the rape of Appalachia, and the subjugation of the First Peoples by those who've considered themselves somehow higher in that hierarchy. And sometimes, of course, society neglects to take rurality into account at all. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to fill in a government form, name, okay, street address, okay, city, Middle River, I always cross out city and write in community. I do, it's my little form of protest. Most recently, we've seen this attitude expressed by a spokesperson from Industry Canada explaining why the department had axed the Community Access Program, or CAP program. Are you familiar with CAP? The spokesperson said, and I quote, "The vast majority of Canadians are now connected to the internet at home, while many more have access through their mobile devices." Brings me to mind of my BlackBerry, really. This is obviously not a person living in a rural community, and certainly not in a marginalized or economically depressed rural community. There are attempts made at the federal government level to apply what is called a rural lens to policy making in Canada. About 10 years ago now, the Rural Secretariat created a tool called the Rural Lens, and the idea is that they wanted to have policymakers look at things through rural eyes to make sure that when policies get set in Ottawa by people who live in cities, that they're taking a rural perspective into account. So to be fair, they have done that. The difficulty with Rural Lens is it's optional, and I have yet to talk to anyone in a federal government department outside of the Rural Secretariat who knows what the Rural Lens is. So after 10 years, I don't see it as being widely taken up at the federal level. So all of these perspectives that I've been sharing with you are, at the very best, incomplete and insulting, and at worst, deeply, deeply harmful to rural communities. And by communities here, I don't just mean human communities. I mean it in the holistic sense of humans, other animals, plants, everyone who inhabits the rural places. So if none of that's the reality of rural life, what's the reality of rural life? Well, I would suggest that it's much more layered than any of these stereotypes would lead us to believe. Okay, there are a few white picket fences, yes, it's true, and there are some, narrow-minded views, and there's some ignorance, but I also believe that there is a quiet revolution taking place in the rural spaces. It's based on ethics like conservation, cooperation, and humility. It's messy, it's complex, it's diverse, it's local, and it's labor-intensive. It's not embracing of certainty. It's learning to live with uncertainty. And its practitioners are concerned about things like loss of species diversity, loss of soils, the question of available water. It's experimental and it's organic, and I don't just mean in terms of agriculture. It involves what I like to think of as the monk class of agriculturalists. We have one here tonight. It might just be our salvation. Now, as I've said, rural dwellers are diverse. The people I'm about to talk about are not representative of every rural dweller, but they are a strong and growing community in the rural landscape. Who are they? Well, they're hard to define. Every year, my husband and I have a Christmas time potluck to bring together the folks of our ilk from around the island. And one time we sat around talking about what we call ourselves. Some said small farmers, some said permaculturalists, some said homesteaders, some said back to the landers, and we all had sort of slightly different ways of describing ourselves. Some even describe themselves as social entrepreneurs, trying to blend a good thing with making a living. What all these people have in common is a desire to participate in what I think of as a living laboratory, an experiment in building more sustainable communities and building a more respectful compact with the land and its inhabitants. Now, if this is sounding like the 60s to you, I don't want you to write it off. There was a wave of people who came back to Cape Breton in the 60s and 70s and back to the landers, and it's very easy for people to say, yeah, right, those tree huggers, they all died off or, smoked too much pot and went away or something. These things do come in waves, but from my experience, these people that I'm talking about who have stuck with it since the 60s, and those of us who are sort of with it now, are not dewy-eyed optimists. It's really bloody hard work. So if it were all about sort of dewy-eyed optimism, I'd be doing something else entirely. Practically speaking, these are people who are concerned about food security, and they want to be able to provide good food grown close to home for themselves and the people around them. They tend to be interested in energy security and the relocalization of goods and services. They often have a sense that some of the byproducts of cheap oil, such as global commerce and cheap transportation and mass-produced food flown in from all over the world, are about to come to an end. They're working to design what James Howard Kunstler would call other arrangements for our communities. And this is work that involves renegotiating our food growing strategies. No small task, which, when you consider just how much of our current food supply depends on cheap oil inputs to run equipment, provide artificial fertility to depleted soils, and to transport food vast distances to global markets. By and large, these monk agriculturalists are not advocating going back to the mule and the scythe. They're trying to blend science and technical knowledge with historic best practices and land wisdom to grow nutritious food that's less dependent on fossil fuel and more dependent on renewables like solar, wind, and muscle power. Wes Jackson, the founder of the Land Institute, calls this farming with contemporary energy, which is a tough phrase I quite like. That's important, but it just fell off. This all involves relearning many old ways that are in danger of being lost. It's kind of a challenge because it's not just a matter of hurling a bunch of seeds in the ground and waiting for stuff to come up. There are a lot of details to growing food that at the small scale that are really difficult to access now because people aren't doing it as much as they were. So that's the practical level. From a philosophical perspective, many of these rural people are folks who are sort of moving away from that old cosmology into a new cosmology, away from that hierarchical view that places God at the top and humans above the rest of creation, and towards a worldview that acknowledges the interconnectedness and interdependence of living systems, of which humans are a part. Rural farmer philosophers like Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson and Joel Salatin are articulating philosophies that are grounded directly in their relationship to the land. And I think that's really important to think about. When you think about philosophy, you think about cerebral work. These are philosophers who are actually farmers, and they're getting their hands dirty, and they're working with the soil, and they're working with the land, and they're affected by the weather, and that's their starting point. And I think that's a really critical distinction, because I feel that we're so separated from the reality of what the natural world teaches us, that a lot of our philosophies, while interesting, are not grounded philosophies. They have been negotiating a new compact for us with the natural world, and in a culture in which we're increasingly alienated from that natural world, these voices are rare, but to me, critically important. But at this point, you might be saying, okay, why should I care whether some guy in gumboots is kicking around the backwoods of Cape Breton trying to grow red fife wheat without a tractor while he ponders the spiritual aspects of agrology? What's that to me? Well, you should care, because from my point of view and from the point of view of many of us who have looked at this, our union contract with Mother Nature has outlived its usefulness, and it's not going to be renewed in its current form. To me, there appears to be a perfect storm on the horizon. And I don't want to depress you about this, because I think storms are often opportunities for great renewal. But the storm that we're seeing encompasses a few things. It encompasses the end of cheap oil, concerns about climate change, the depletion of major aquifers in North America that currently allow us to produce vast quantities of food inexpensively, the degradation of agricultural soils, loss of habitat and species diversity, and the one that keeps me up at night, acidification of the world's oceans. These are huge, complex issues, and nobody can tell you with complete certainty which factors are going to play a role and when, and I'm not even going to pretend that I can. I hope to God some of them don't play a role. I hope I'm wrong. I'd love to stand here 20 years from now and go, right, I was wrong. Sorry about that, false alarm. But, from everything that I'm looking at, and those of us in this sort of mindset that I'm talking about are looking at, it really does seem certain that we're going to be looking forward to rising fuel costs and skyrocketing food prices and various kinds of fairly unhappy feedback from Mother Nature. One challenge on the horizon is that in North America, we have evolved a high-tech industrial agricultural model which feeds a lot of people at relatively low cost at the grocery till, but with astronomical costs in terms of animal welfare, environmental integrity, fossil fuel use, water inputs, soil health, human nutrition, and rural community sustainability. The Union of Concerned Scientists has spoken urgently against this model of agriculture, and a 2011 United Nations report authored by Olivier de Schuiter, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, sorry Olivier, condemned industrial agriculture as, quote, simply not the best choice anymore. So there is an awakening realization that what we've been doing isn't going to be sustainable forever. And that's really great, because when my husband Brooke and I first started to go to conferences about agriculture, well, in Brooke's case, probably 20 years ago, in my case, more like 10, that recognition wasn't there at the provincial and the federal level at all. And what we were doing, and those of us of our ilk were doing, was kind of laughed at. Now you go to those conferences and those meetings and it's recognized, yeah, this is happening. But if industrial agriculture isn't sustainable, then we're going to have to come up with other ways of feeding ourselves. It's not as simple as just going down to the store and getting some lettuce flown in from California. Some folks are working on solving this problem by figuring out how to make meat in a test tube. Others of us are putting our energies into rejuvenating small-scale farming. Yay! If you look at the environmental challenges that the human species is now facing, it seems to me that we need an all-hands-on-deck approach to finding solutions. Some people say technology will save us. Relax, they'll figure out, some sort of thing that's going to replace oil as the cheap, accessible fuel for our economy. And there are lots of innovative technical advances that may play a role. And others are trying to make change at the level of world governments within organizations like the UN or the IPCC. There's the grassroots approach typified by the Occupy movement. In the urban realm, the new urbanists have contributed a great deal in terms of rethinking city spaces and their potential for food growing and natural or harmonious natural relationships. But we also need the countryside. We need the wisdom of those who live cheek by jowl with the land and who have learned some humility in the process. And you do learn some humility when you work with the land. It will teach you pretty darn quick that you're not in charge. We need the monk agriculturalists and the small farmers whose daily toil is testament to the innovation and creative thinking we need, to their ability to do more with less. Basically, we need a backup plan in case the technocrats fail us and in case alternatives to cheap fossil energy end up being slow in coming. The surest route to survival in an ecosystem is via biodiversity, or as anthropologist Wade Davis argues, ethnodiversity. I'm not buying into the notion that rural is a better way to live than urban. I'm not saying that, but rural is different than urban. Rural cultures represent a knowledge base and a philosophical orientation not found in cities, and it's worth preserving. So I want to close by posing a question. What would this place look like if we turned the current paradigm on its head? If instead of pouring money into Halifax and to a lesser extent Sydney, and telling everybody that there's going to be a trickle-down effect that will eventually reach the countryside, what if we actually invested in rural communities and let that trickle down? What if instead of building bigger schools in large communities and busing rural children farther and farther from home to obtain an education, we actually embrace the small community school model as the focal point for community learning, for children, for adults, for seniors? What if we actually used our web technology to connect all of those little learning nodes and allowed children to feel safe and embraced in their home communities rather than constantly giving Cape Breton rural youth the message that they have to go down the road to thrive? What if instead of standardizing a curriculum in a one-size-fits-all approach, we created a rural curriculum that reflected local realities and gave rural children a sense of hope about living where they live and a sense of pride? What if instead of buying into an industrial food system, we embraced the products of our own soil along with the people who work it? What would Cape Breton look like in a world where rural mattered?